Now that Dragonflight is coming to a close and the War Within is close approaching, it is time to consider how hero talents and other potential changes may shape Fire Mage in the years to come. Hello again, this is Preheat. Welcome back to another World of Warcraft video. So before we look forward to the new Mage hero talents, let's take a moment to recap Dragonflight. The evolution of Fire Mage gameplay throughout the duration of Dragonflight is best summarized by looking at the talent tree and changes to it over the expansion. By looking at these changes, we can see the direction Fire has taken and perhaps make some predictions about hero talents as well. Fire Mage gameplay is simple at first glance. The goal is to just cast as many Pyroblasts as possible, while maintaining various buffs and having as much uptime on your cooldown combustion as possible. Hot Streak is the primary vehicle for shipping those Pyroblasts into the faces of our enemies, and casting spells with combustion alongside Fire Blast usage is the best way to generate crits to convert those heating ups into Hot Streaks. This is the core gameplay loop of Fire and has been since before the Dragonflight talent system. Dragonflight introduced a new talent tree system, and now we've had plenty of time to get familiar with it. Overall, the system has been a success, but it wasn't always this way. Mage talents had a very rocky start at the start of Dragonflight, but with the rework in 10.1.5, the talent trees have been greatly improved. Hopefully this upward trajectory continues in the War Within. There's a lot to like about Mage talents. The class tree introduces many powerful and fun ways to make choices. Mass Barrier gives mages a fun way to support their group beyond Arcane Intellect, making food and portals. Ice Cold provides a much needed alternative to Ice Block when immunity isn't needed. And the removal of Rune of Power is a very welcome change, although the loss of burst from it can be felt. For Raid, a lot of the talent choices for Fire have become a bit standardized or cookie cutter. There's some interesting options like Flame Accelerant, Meteor, Alexstrasza's Fury that can perform well depending on the situation, but most of the time you just kind of pick the same talents regardless of the situation. Now for Mythic Plus, Fire actually has some interesting choices. There's actually some variety when it comes to build for AoE damage. So for quick damage and packs of enemies that won't last long, you're going to be using the Flamestrike build, which can blast AoE. The addition of Fuel to Fire makes this gameplay feel a lot more rewarding than the past. You actually get feedback from Flamestrike the same way you would with Pyroblast because it generates heating up. Now for situations where the pack may live longer, you have the Ignite build, and basically the idea is you're creating fuel for a very intense fire by attacking one enemy and having those ignites spread off to all of the other enemies and burning everything using your Mastery Ignite. The talent system works for Mage, but there's always room for improvement. Combustion uptime is very important to Fire, which brings us to Sun King's Blessing, and there is no other talent for Fire that shapes the gameplay more. Sun King's Blessing allows for greatly increased combustion uptime and hot streak generation in turn. This has many benefits or consequences depending on how you look at it, but the main points are that it pushes Fire towards being an uptime spec, and it requires frequent hard casting. So number one, Sun King's Blessing stacks are generated by consuming Hot Streak. More Sun King's Blessing stacks means more combustion uptime, which means more Hot Streaks, which means more Sun King's Blessing uptime, which means more Hot Streaks, etc., etc., etc. Around and around it goes. But the bottom line is, Fire requires constant uptime in order to reach its full potential and is easily derailed by interruptions. Every class loses damage when things go sideways, but Fire is punished more for doing this than most other specs. Number two, Sun King's Blessing is activated by hard casting Pyroblast or Flamestrike, which means that the spec is often focused into long casts. Now, this isn't really an issue right now because we have a lot of haste, right? Current haste levels are very high, but in the new expansion, whenever that comes around, this will be a heavy loss of secondary stats, so you're going to feel it a lot more. But thankfully, we have Shimmer and Ice Flows to help with this. But frequent hard casting can be frustrating at times, especially when a spec demands high uptime. Number three, Sun King's Blessing also interacts strangely with Fuel to Fire, making a hard casted Flamestrike result in a wasted proc if cast while queuing a Hot Streak. Basically, if you're doing Flamestrike and you're trying to queue up an instant Flamestrike at the end, you have Sun King's Blessing, you're going to waste a Hot Streak. You're going to munch a proc. Sun King's Blessing isn't all bad though. It's a very powerful talent, adds a lot of flavor to Fire. The main issue is just that you don't really have options to choose other things. Due to the tuning, you're stuck playing SKB no matter what. Bloodlust is a group cooldown, which means that when to use it is often a group decision. Mages have access to this with Time Warp, and Temporal Warp is the talent that allows mages to give themselves a second Time Warp. This means that you get a lot of haste, usually above 100% with good gear, but luckily for Fire, we are able to make full use of this haste, and we don't have issues with overcapping due to high haste. The issue with this talent is that it is tied to your Time Warp button, and sometimes the correct strategy is to hold Bloodlust for a vital part of the fight. This means that mages have a cooldown that they want to press as soon as possible, but they have to ask permission from the group to press. This can lead to a lot of unnecessary friction in group play, since it's almost always in the mage's best interest to Bloodlust on the pull. You might be wondering, why is this talent not a separate button like every other talent? To answer that question, we need to go all the way back to 2016. So one of the systems in the Legion expansion was legendary items, and in this expansion, we had a ring called the Shard of the Exodar. Look familiar? Back in Legion, there were stricter limitations on what this effect could do, so the functionality was baked into an existing spell, Time Warp. When the item effect was copy-pasted into Shadowlands with memory of Temporal Warp and then Dragonflight, some things changed, but the limitation or flavor, depending on how you see it, of tying it to an existing spell did not change. This would be fine if there was a good alternative, but Time Anomaly is unfortunately a downgrade at best. Randomly getting buffs sounds fun in theory, but the main thing you notice with this talent is it just buffs you in the worst moments possible, and in a lot of cases, it's just completely useless. This is not a good alternative to Temporal Warp. Every class has dead talents, but Fire suffers the most below the capstone line. When Hyperthermia was changed to not proc during combustion, the talent became very undertuned. Deep Impact can be seen as a downgrade in most situations, and Unleashed Inferno is extremely weak compared to Sun King's Blessing. These talents have been dead the entire expansion, effectively reducing the choices for Fire Mage capstones to just Sun King's Blessing. The only time they're ever really used is in PvP, a mode that has its own enforced adjustments to spells that change the balancing separately from the rest of the game. Since PvP already has a rebalance for most spells, why can't these talents just be tuned for PvE separately? Fire also has a surprising amount of buffs and debuffs that stack and should be maintained. A lot of these abilities need to be used strategically to maintain the buffs while also interacting with Hot Streak, which means you have to juggle them while avoiding munching or wasting procs. This further reinforces Fire's reliance on constant uptime. So for example, Sun King's Blessing stacks to 8 and must be used as soon as it's generated unless there is downtime. Improved Scorch, execute only, you play around maintaining this at 3 stacks. Field of Burn, you play around maintaining this at 3 stacks as much as you can. Firemind is mostly ignored, but comes from Hot Streak, and it should stay at 3 stacks pretty much the entire fight. Fevered Incantation is mostly ignored as well. It has a short duration and is canceled if you don't crit. This one stacks 4 times. We also have the tier bonuses. So Fire Mage Season 2 set bonus requires us to maintain a debuff on the target at all times using Phoenix Flame. And we also have the current Season 1, Season 3 tier bonus. This is mostly ignored, but it does stack up to 5, and you want to maintain this as much as you can. So some players enjoy the added difficulty of maintaining these buffs while also not wasting resources and doing the rest of the rotation, but as more effects are added to be juggled all at the same time, the bloat can really be felt. Flamestrike is a spell with a reticle. That's a green circle that appears whenever you press the button. Reticles are fine for spells that are casted occasionally, but Flamestrike is used very frequently when playing the Flamestrike builds. The solution here obviously is to use an @cursor macro for the spells to automatically place it where your mouse is, but playing this way anchors your mouse to a specific part of your screen since every other cast is a Flamestrike. So essentially you lose access to your mouse while playing this way, and you have to adapt by just flicking it around between your globals. It's not very fun. Flamestrike also has other issues, especially when it comes to Sun King's Blessing, which we've already covered. It's also a ground effect, which means that movement can heavily affect your damage whenever you're playing something like Flame Patch. I do want to say though, Fuel of Fire has greatly improved Flamestrike gameplay, but it still has a ways to go before it feels as fluid as Pyroblast. All right, let's talk about hero talents. Fire also will have access to Sunfury and Frostfire hero talents in the War Within. We don't really know what this entails yet, but what I'm hoping to see for Fire are new talents that allow us to break the mold of Fire being tied to constant uptime and having a flattened damage profile. Once upon a time, Fire was known for being a high burst spec, along with having very strong 2-minute cooldowns. So having this be an option again would introduce a lot of variety to an otherwise kind of stale spec when it comes to raid gameplay. It's also a bit hard to predict what Blizzard will come up with whenever it comes to new talents, but the names of these hero talents each carry a heavy aesthetic and fantasy to pull from. So based on the names and our knowledge of past mage design, let's take a moment to daydream. No NPC embodies the concept of Sunfury more than Keltas Sunstrider and his followers. So Prince Keltas is heavily associated with the Phoenix. That's a mythological firebird with the power of rebirth. And every time we strike him down, he somehow comes back into the story. It's a safe bet to assume that these hero talents will interact with Phoenix Flames, but we'll have to figure out how it's going to interact. So one way could be maybe you'll summon Phoenix Guardians whenever you use this spell. Maybe you'll call down Pillars of Flame. Both of these are in line with the fantasy there. There'll also likely be a tie-in for Blazing Barrier to be upgraded to Cloak of Flames, and other upgrades for our fire spells that have an emphasis on area of effect. Aside from summoning Phoenixes though, and using fire-themed spells, Keltas Sunstrider is also heavily associated with gravity magic, Arcane Disruption, Mind Control. These are all arcane spells and they kind of tie into Sunfury. And since Sunfury is also shared with Arcane, it's very likely that we see some sort of flavor with Arcane, although I'm not sure if it's going to be tied to these old boss mechanics. My hope is that Sunfury gives fire some benefit for combustion that actually restores the gameplay to its old high burst self. Ideally something that allows for more freedom with existing talents and moves it away from the cooldown reduction and uptime spec that it is currently. Frostfire is an interesting contradiction, but of course this is a fantasy world, so we can have contradictions like this. In the past, Mage had Frostfire Bolt as a spell and is scaled with talents on both the Fire and the Frost tree, so it's a very good talent. The spell was later moved to be Frost exclusive, and then it was replaced with Flurry as your Brain Freeze proc. The term is also used in Frostfire Ridge. This is a zone in Warlords of Draenor. The official description for this zone is, quote, a harsh land of ceaseless winter and volcanic peaks where travelers encounter molten lava as often as painfully cold snow. So we don't really have a lot to go off of here, but it's very likely that these hero talents will come with some sort of blue recolor for spells. It'll also probably tie into some more ancient primalist volcanic magic. My hope is for some variety in gameplay, so as long as the gameplay is different from Sunfury, I'll be happy. But beyond this, it would be kind of cool if Frostfire maybe dipped into multicasting or spell combos. I think that would actually fit really well with the hybrid spell scheme, but I'm not really sure what it would look like in practice. Overall, I'm mostly happy with the design of Fire currently, and I'm cautiously optimistic about hero talents. But what do you think of the hero talents coming into War Within? Leave a comment below with what your own theories are, and if you like this video, be sure to give it a thumbs up, and if you want to see more of my content, be sure to subscribe to the channel, ring that notification bell, and hopefully I see you in the next one.